Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Josh and this is Two Boys and a Bible. So in our last video we went over who Nicodemus was, and I'd really encourage you, if you haven't already, to go and check it out, because this video that we're going to do right now, this passage that we're going to go over, Nicodemus is a main character here. So if you don't know who Nicodemus is, go and watch the previous video. I'll link it right above. So let's get right into it. John chapter 3 verses 1 through 8. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you have come from God as a teacher, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Jesus answered and said to him, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus said to him, How can a man be born when he is old? He cannot enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born, can he? Jesus answered, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Do not be amazed that I said to you, you must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but do not know where it comes from and where it is going. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. So as usual, we're just going to go through this passage verse by verse and see what this passage has for us. So in verse 1, the writer, John, just introduces the scene. He says that Nicodemus came and he introduces who Nicodemus was. He was a Pharisee. And in verse 2, he starts off this passage and he says that this ruler, this Pharisee, came to Jesus by night. And Nicodemus said to him, he says that, Rabbi, we know that you have come from God as a teacher, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. See, Nicodemus had recognized that Jesus had come from God, and he wanted to know more, right? This man is a Pharisee, and he wanted to know who this man is. It says that he's seen his works and seen what he's done. Clearly, this man can only come from one place, and that is from God. See, the reason that Nicodemus knew that Jesus was from God was because of the signs that Jesus did. Yet, it's interesting that in this gospel, as if you've been following along, I'm sure you've realized that the only sign that Jesus has done so far is the miracle at Cana, at the wedding in Cana, where Jesus turned the water into wine. So it's obvious that Nicodemus had heard about Jesus and heard what he's able to do. Probably he heard about what happened at Cana. But it's important to note that in this gospel, in fact in all the gospels, not all of the things that Jesus did were recorded. Not all of his signs and wonders were recorded. I mean, even the Apostle John writes this in John chapter 21, verse 25. It says, And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. So Jesus, while he was on this earth, did so many signs and so many wonders that it's not even possible to write all of them. So I'm sure that Nicodemus had heard of some of these, and this is why he wanted to come to Jesus. Now another thing to note is that Nicodemus called Jesus Rabbi. Now, Rabbi isn't really a term that we use in today's English. So what does Rabbi mean? Well, Rabbi simply means teacher, right? It was used back in chapter 1 about who Jesus was. So it's clear that now Jesus has started teaching because people are calling him Rabbi. So we can conclude from verse 2 that Nicodemus recognizes that Jesus is someone special and that he must be from God, and that what he has to say is quite important. Now in verse 3, Jesus gets straight to the point. He doesn't waste time. He says, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Now, in this conversation, there's nothing like, hey, how are you? I'm doing good. Jesus gets straight to the point. And what he mentions is very interesting. This is the first time in the whole Bible that the phrase born again is used. And it is used in a very important sense. So many of us sometimes we ask people, are you born again? Or, you must be born again, like what Jesus said. But what does it mean to actually be born again? If you think about it, it's kind of a strange phrase, isn't it? So, if you're confused about what the phrase born again means, don't worry, because even Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews, was also confused. We see this in verse 4. Nicodemus said to him, "How can a man be born when he is old? He cannot enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born, can he?" So it's important to note that Nicodemus took this phrase, born again, in its most literal sense. He's wondering, to be born means to, you know, come out from your mother, if I could put it that way. But how is it possible to be born twice? To be born again? Can that even happen again? That's not really possible, is it? So it's easy to understand why or how Nicodemus got confused. So in verses 5 through 8, Jesus begins to explain what he means by being born again. In verse 5, he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God." So in verse 5, Jesus mentions the two things that need to happen before you can enter the kingdom of God. But I'd like you to notice the parallelism between verses 3 and verse 5. So here in verse 3, Jesus mentions born again. In verse 5, he mentions born of water and the Spirit. So he's equating born again with those two things, water and the Spirit. He is also equating seeing the kingdom of God with entering the kingdom of God. So those two things are synonymous. So you might ask, okay, what does it mean to be born of water? And what does it mean to be born of the Spirit? Jesus continues to clarify what he means in verse 6. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. So again, notice the parallelism between verses 5 and verse 6. So born of water, in verse 5, he equates with that which is born of flesh is flesh in verse 6. And being born of the Spirit in verse 5, he equates with that which is born of the Spirit is spirit in verse 6. So this is very important to notice. To be born of water means to be born of the flesh. And to be born of the Spirit means to be born of the Spirit. Now, Jesus will, further down in these verses, Jesus will explain more about what it means to be born of the Spirit. So what does it mean to be born of the flesh, though? Born of water, born of the flesh is the same thing. So what does that mean? The most natural meaning of born of the flesh is being born physically, from your mother. And the context supports this interpretation. Like in verse 4, Nicodemus thought, that's what he normally thought, right? He normally thought that to be born means to be born physically. And Jesus is saying that you need to be born again. So something on top of what you have already been born into. And everyone on this earth has already been born physically. We've already been born once. That's very apparent, right? You can't be alive if you haven't been born. So we see here that the meaning of born of the flesh means to be born physically. The meaning of born of water means to be born physically. The context supports this, and that's also the natural meaning of the words. Now, many people think that being born of water means to be baptized, right? Because when you're baptized, you're placed into water and then you're brought out. So they think that, when it says born of water, it means to be baptized. But as we've seen, this is not the case. To be born of water means to be born of the flesh, which means to be born physically from your mother. So then in verse 7, Jesus says, "Do not be amazed that I said to you, you must be born again." Now, why would Jesus say that Nicodemus should not be amazed? Well, every single human on this earth has been born once. We mentioned this already. We have already been born of water. We've already been born of the flesh, which is the same thing. So Jesus is saying that we should not be surprised when another birth is required for us to enter the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. As we know, not everyone on this earth will enter the kingdom of God. It's sad, but that's the reality. People are brought up in sin. People are sinful. So not everyone is going to enter the kingdom of God. So it makes sense that another birth is required to enter this kingdom. Another birth other than the one that all of us already have. Now in verse 8, Jesus begins to explain this second birth. He begins to explain what it means to be born of the Spirit. He says, "The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but do not know where it comes from and where it is going. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit." So Jesus was previously talking about being born physically, being born of the flesh. Now he moves on to the second birth, being born of the Spirit. Here he points out that being born of the Spirit is not like being born of the flesh. Being born of the flesh is a very physical thing, right? We can see the baby and we have our physical bodies. But being born of the Spirit is not like that. We do not see the physical appearance of someone who is being born of the Spirit. And Jesus uses a very interesting illustration to explain this. He uses an example of the wind, right? We cannot see the wind. We don't know where it comes from or where it's going. So how do we know that there's even such a thing as wind? It's because we see the evidence of it, right? We can feel it blowing, right, on our skin. We see the trees going like this, the leaves on the trees blowing in the wind, right? So we see the evidence of it. Therefore, we know that wind exists. And it's the same thing with those who are born of the Spirit. There is no physical appearance of someone who is born of the Spirit, right? They look the same as before they were born of the Spirit. So then how do we know that such a thing as being born of the Spirit exists? It's because of the evidence. Generally speaking, those who are born of the Spirit are very different than those who are only born of the flesh. They're different in how they act, how they speak, in the things that they do. And it's by that evidence that we can say, I believe that this person is born again. I believe that this person is born of the Spirit because of what we see them do. Now, it's important to note that being born of the Spirit does not necessitate a change of life. Someone who is only born of the flesh, right? They've only been born once. That person may act just the same as a person who is born of the Spirit, who is born again. Yet, and in our minds, we may think that, that person has been born again because of the way that they do things. But it's important to note that that does not necessitate being born again. A good life does not necessitate being born of the Spirit. You and I cannot see into people's hearts. Only God can see into people's hearts, and only God can truly know if someone has been born again, has been born of the Spirit. And I'd really encourage you to stick around for the next video, because as the passage goes on, as this conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus continues, Jesus will explain how to be born again, how to be born of the Spirit. So I'd really encourage you to watch out for our next video, because there we're going to discuss how to be born again. We're going to look at the words of Jesus and what he told Nicodemus of how to be born of the Spirit. So I just like to end with a couple verses that may give you a hint about what we're going to be talking about in the next video. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 13 and 14.